On our second wedding anniversary road trip, my husband planned to kill me. He didn't know I'd overheard him and his mother scheming in her hospital room 3 days earlier. When the pump truck's boom came crashing down, I wrenched the steering wheel and made sure the passenger side took the full impact. By the time his mother arrived at the funeral home, his ashes were already swirling down a storm drain. You want to steal a widow's inheritance while she's still breathing? You'd better make sure she's actually dead first. The pump truck's boom didn't just hit the car. It came down like a guillotine forged from rusted steel and wet concrete, a blunt, brutal force that sheared through the passenger side with the sound of God tearing sheet metal in half. What had been an intact sedan milliseconds earlier became a broken shell. Glass atomized. The seatbelt anchors ripped from the chassis. And everything that had occupied the space beside me, the leather seat, the crumpled road map, the man I had married 2 years ago, was simply obliterated. The accident report would later call it a freak construction mishap. A pump truck operator with a faulty pressure gauge. A boom arm that swung when it should have held steady. A tragic, unforeseeable convergence of mechanical failure and human error. I called it something else. I called it the moment I chose to live. My left arm was still wrapped in a plaster cast when I signed the cremation papers, the kind that hung from my neck on a blue medical sling and made even the simplest movements, opening a door, holding a pen, feel like small victories. The funeral director was a tired man in his 50s with kind eyes and the careful, measured voice of someone who had spent decades guiding strangers through the worst days of their lives. He looked at my sling. He looked at my face, still cross-stitched with black sutures that traced my cheekbone and jawline like railroad tracks across ruined earth. He looked at the purple bruising that spread from my collarbone up into my hairline. And then he asked, very gently, whether I might want to wait a few days before making any permanent decisions. Ma'am, the body can be held. You don't need to rush this. When you're feeling stronger. I'm strong enough, I said. He studied me for a long moment. Something in my expression must have told him that waiting was not an option I was willing to entertain. He nodded, pushed the paperwork across his desk, and handed me a pen. I signed in triplicate. My signature was steady. Each letter formed with deliberate precision, as though I were signing the deed to a house rather than authorizing the destruction of human remains. The only sound in the room was the scratch of pen on paper and the soft hum of the building's ventilation system, circulating air that carried the faint, sweet undertone of industrial-grade disinfectant. When it was done, the director asked if I wanted to view the body first. For closure, he said. Many families found it helpful. I don't need closure, I told him. I need him gone. The cremation took 40 minutes. I stood at the observation window the entire time, my good hand pressed flat against the heat-resistant glass. The furnace roared on the other side, a sound like a dragon breathing in its sleep. Inside, temperatures climbed past 2,000 degrees Fahrenheit. Human tissue vaporized. Bone calcified and then shattered. The man I had shared my bed with for 730 nights was reduced to elemental components, carbon, calcium, trace minerals, nothing more. The technician, a young man with acne scars and an ill-fitting uniform, kept glancing at me nervously. He'd probably seen every possible grief response in this room. The screamers. The fainters. The ones who collapsed into the arms of relatives and had to be carried out. But he'd probably never seen anyone like me, a woman who stood motionless as a statue, face blank, eyes dry, watching her husband's corpse burn with the detached interest of someone waiting for a pot to boil. When the furnace cycled down and the technician opened the retrieval door, a wave of heat rolled through the observation room. He pulled out a long metal tray, and there they were. The ashes. Gray-white and granular, still radiating warmth, carrying the faint metallic scent of incinerated bone. Small chunks of harder material were visible among the powder, femur fragments, perhaps, or pieces of skull that had resisted the heat. He asked if I wanted an urn. He had a catalog. Mahogany with brass inlay. Marble with velvet lining. A biodegradable eco-pod that could be planted with a tree. "I'll take a bag," I said. "I'm sorry. A plastic bag. The kind you use for trash." He blinked. His mouth opened and then closed. 20 years in the funeral industry, and this was clearly a first. But his professional instincts held, and he disappeared into a supply closet, returning with a heavy black garbage bag that crinkled when I took it. I poured the ashes in myself. The technician made a small sound of protest, something about proper handling protocols, but I ignored him. Gray dust coated my fingers. A fine particulate cloud rose from the bag and settled on my coat, my hair, the lenses of my glasses. I didn't brush it off. Behind the funeral home, I found what I was looking for. A drainage ditch ran along the back property line, half hidden by overgrown weeds and a chain-link fence with a bent corner that was easy to duck under. The water inside was murky and yellow-brown, fed by runoff from the parking lot and whatever leaked from the building's aging plumbing. Cigarette butts bobbed on the surface like tiny, waterlogged corpses. A single condom, translucent and swollen, drifted lazily near the culvert pipe. And there, belly up near a clump of algae, floated a dead frog, its legs splayed in the rigor mortis of the forgotten. I opened the bag. This was the moment, I knew, that should have felt climactic. A dramatic gesture of finality, the kind that in movies would be accompanied by swelling orchestral music and a slow-motion shot of ash catching the wind. But the reality was quieter. Just a woman in a wrinkled coat with one arm in a sling, standing beside a drainage ditch on an overcast Tuesday, pouring her husband's remains into the water like she was emptying a vacuum cleaner. The ashes hit the surface and spread in a gray bloom, then began to sink. Most dissolved immediately. The heavier fragments, those stubborn pieces of bone, settled on the bottom among the sediment and discarded bottle caps. I thought about the first time Ethan told me he loved me. We'd been dating for 3 months, and he'd taken me to a rooftop restaurant I couldn't afford on my own salary, the kind with white tablecloths and candles in frosted glass holders. He'd reached across the table, taken my hand, and said the words with such intensity that I'd actually believed him. "You're the one, Emma. I've been waiting my whole life for you." What he'd actually been waiting for was the payout. 10 life insurance policies. A year and a half of careful planning. A staged car accident on a mountain road. And me, conveniently dead, unable to ask any questions. I watched the last swirl of ash disappear into the murk and thought, you wanted to eat my inheritance while I was still breathing? Let's see how well you digest this. The day I found out, I wasn't supposed to be at the hospital at all. It was a Thursday afternoon in late September, the kind of day where summer and autumn tangle together in the air, warm enough for short sleeves but with a crisp undercurrent that promised colder weeks ahead. I'd left the office at 3, which I almost never did. The company I'd built from nothing, a boutique marketing firm that had grown from my dining room table into a 12-person operation, usually kept me chained to my desk well past 6. But Ethan had been spending every evening at the hospital with his mother, and guilt had been gnawing at me all week. Linda had been in the cardiac ward for 7 days, a scare with her arrhythmia that the doctors kept describing as manageable, in that careful tone that suggested the opposite. Ethan was an only child. His father had died when he was 12. The burden of care fell entirely on him, and by extension, on me. I'd spent 3 hours that afternoon making pigeon soup. Not because I was a particularly devoted cook. Before Ethan, my culinary repertoire began and ended with pasta and Jared sauce, but because Linda had told me, early in our marriage, that pigeon soup was good for the blood. She'd said it with the casual authority of old-world wisdom, the kind that didn't require scientific backing because it had been true in her family for 4 generations. So I'd gone to the Asian market on Cedar Street, bought a fresh pigeon from the butcher who knew me by name now, and simmered it with red dates and goji berries and a piece of ginger the size of my thumb. The broth had turned a rich golden color, and the whole apartment had filled with the earthy, medicinal smell of it. I'd poured it into a thermal container, the nice one with the vacuum seal that I'd bought specifically for hospital visits, and driven to the medical center feeling virtuous. Feeling like a good wife. Feeling like a good daughter-in-law. What a fool I'd been. The cardiac ward was on the 16th floor, a VIP wing with private rooms and views of the river that cost more per night than my first apartment's monthly rent. Linda had insisted on it, and Ethan had agreed, and I'd paid. I'd paid for everything: the hospital bills, the specialist consultations, the private nurses who checked her vitals every 4 hours. Because that's what family did, wasn't it? You took care of each other. You shared resources. You didn't keep score. The elevator ride took forever, stopping at what felt like every floor to admit nurses in scrubs, visitors clutching flower arrangements, a janitor pushing a mop bucket that sloshed gray water onto the linoleum. By the time I reached 16, the thermal container had begun to feel heavy in my hands, and I developed a slight headache from the recycled air and the Muzak version of Yesterday that had been playing on a loop. The nurse's station was quiet when I stepped off. Linda's favorite nurse, a young woman named Grace with pink-framed glasses and an endless supply of patients, recognized me and waved. She's in her room. Your husband just got here about 20 minutes ago. Thanks, Grace. How's she doing today? Better, I think. The new medication seems to be helping with the palpitations. She lowered her voice. She's been in a good mood. Talking about her grandson. I frowned. Her grandson. Maybe I misheard. Grace shrugged, already turning back to her computer. You know how patients can be. The meds make them a little loopy sometimes. I should have paid more attention to that moment. Should have stopped and asked more questions. But I was already walking down the hall toward room 1608, rehearsing the cheerful greeting I'd planned, the way I'd say, "Mom, I brought you soup," and she'd smile and pat my hand and tell me I was such a thoughtful girl. The door was partially open. That's what saved me. Linda's voice came through first, sharp and impatient in a way I'd never heard before. The saccharine warmth she usually wrapped around every word was gone, replaced by something cold and hard and utterly unrecognizable. That little bitch, when are you finally going to deal with her? I'm sitting in this goddamn hospital bed while she's out there spending my grandson's inheritance. How much longer do I have to wait? The words didn't make sense at first. My brain tried to rearrange them into something less horrifying. A misunderstanding. A joke. Maybe she was talking about someone else, a character in one of the soap operas she watched all day, the volume cranked up so loud I could hear the dramatic organ stings from the hallway. Then Ethan spoke, and the last fragile hope I'd been clutching shattered. Mom, it's not that simple. His voice was tired, defensive. The voice of someone who'd had this conversation many times before. There are security cameras everywhere. Traffic cameras. Dash cams. You can't just kill someone and walk away anymore. Everything leaves a digital footprint. We'd get caught. Then don't get caught. Linda's voice was pure acid. Make it look like an accident. A car crash. A fall. God, Ethan, you're supposed to be the smart one. Figure it out. It's not. She has no one. No parents, no siblings, no family at all. Who's going to ask questions? The police will close the case in a week. And all that money, that company of hers, those properties, everything she has just sitting there, it all goes to you. Her voice dropped, conspiratorial. It all goes to my grandson. I stopped breathing. The thermal container slipped in my hands, and I caught it against my chest, clutching it like a shield. The broth sloshed inside, still hot, the warmth seeping through the metal and into my palms. I could feel my heartbeat in my ears, a low thunder that was slowly drowning out everything else. A grandson. Ethan had a child with someone else. He's 2 years old, Ethan. 2. How much longer are you going to make him wait for the life he deserves? I know, Mom. I know. Then do something about it. Your father, rest his soul, never had the stomach for this kind of thing either. But I did what needed to be done. For this family. And now it's your turn. The silence that followed was worse than the words. Because it was an agreeing silence. A planning silence. The kind of silence that meant Ethan was nodding, or staring at the floor with that guilty expression I knew so well, or already running through the logistics of how to murder his wife and make it look like fate. I stepped backward, away from the door. My heels made no sound on the hospital-grade carpet. The thermal container was shaking now, tiny ripples spreading across the surface of the soup inside. I looked down at my hands and noticed that my knuckles were white where I was gripping the metal. And then I noticed the pain, a sharp, localized burning in my palms, and realized that my fingernails had been digging into my flesh hard enough to break skin. 4 crescent-shaped cuts, beading with blood. I didn't feel the pain. I couldn't feel anything except a cold, spreading numbness that started in my chest and radiated outward in waves, like ice forming on a pond, crystal by crystal, until everything was frozen solid. I walked to the restroom at the end of the hall. It was a single-occupancy room with a lock on the door and a small window that looked out onto the parking garage. The fluorescent light flickered overhead, casting everything in a sickly green pallor. I knelt on the cold tile floor, the same floor that orderlies mopped every night with industrial disinfectant, and I lifted the lid of the toilet. The soup poured out in a golden stream. Red dates swirled in the bowl. A piece of ginger caught on the porcelain edge before sliding down into the water. I kept pouring until the container was empty, and then I knelt there for a long moment, staring at the mess I'd made. She didn't deserve a single drop. I stood up. My knees ached from the tile. I walked to the sink, turned on the cold water, and splashed it across my face until my skin was numb. Then I looked at myself in the mirror. The woman who looked back was someone I barely recognized. Not because she was different, same brown hair pulled back in a clip, same minimal makeup, same blouse I'd bought at the Nordstrom sale last month, but because everything behind her eyes had changed. There was a clarity there now, a stillness that I'd never seen before. The fog of trust and love and hopeful naivety that I'd been breathing for 2 years had lifted, and what remained was cold, clean oxygen. The air of a high mountain pass where nothing grew. They wanted me dead. My husband and my mother-in-law had been sitting in that hospital room, the room I was paying for, eating the food I'd brought, accepting the love I'd offered, and they'd been planning how to end my life and steal everything I had. Fine, I thought. Fine. If that's how this game is played, then let's play. The first person I called was Tiffany. Not the police. Not a lawyer. Tiffany Chen, my best friend since freshman year of college, who'd held my hair back when I threw up cheap tequila at a frat party and who'd stood beside me at my parents' funeral and who'd told me, with complete sincerity, that she would help me bury a body if I ever needed her to. I'd laughed at that. I wasn't laughing now. We met at a park by the river, the one with the walking trail where couples pushed strollers and retirees walked small, yappy dogs. It was almost sunset by the time I got there, the sky turning shades of pink and orange that would have been beautiful under any other circumstances. Tiffany was already waiting, leaning against the hood of her silver Honda with her arms crossed and a cigarette tucked behind her ear that she wasn't smoking. She'd quit 3 years ago, but she still carried one everywhere, a talisman against stress. "The hell happened to you?" she said as soon as she saw my face. "You look like you've seen a ghost." Worse. I overheard a conversation. I told her everything. The hospital. The pigeon soup. The words that had come through that partially open door, each one landing like a hammer blow. By the time I finished, Tiffany's face had gone through several distinct phases: confusion, disbelief, horror, and had finally settled on a cold fury that I'd only seen once before, when a guy at a bar had grabbed my wrist and wouldn't let go. She didn't scream. She didn't cry. She just stood there for a long moment, breathing through her nose, and then she said, very quietly, "I'm going to destroy them. We need evidence first." "Oh, I'll get you evidence." She pulled out her phone. "I've got a contact at a corporate investigation firm. Ex-FBI. She can find anything on anyone. Give me 48 hours. Check insurance policies first. Life insurance. Under my name." Tiffany looked up from her phone, her eyes narrowing. "You think? He's been planning this for a while. I want to know how long." The call came at 11:30 that night. I was sitting in my parked car in the driveway of our house, the house I'd bought with my inheritance, the house where Ethan and I had painted the living room together and planted roses in the backyard and argued about whether to get a dog, and I couldn't bring myself to go inside. Not yet. Not while he was in there, sleeping in our bed, probably dreaming about his other woman and his other child and the life insurance payout that would free him from me forever. 10 policies, Tiffany said. Her voice was flat. Professional. The voice she used at work when delivering bad news to clients. 10 separate accidental death policies, taken out with 3 different insurance companies. The first one was purchased 18 months ago, about 6 months after your wedding. Total payout if you die in an accident. Just over $800,000. Beneficiary on all of them is Ethan Harper. $800,000. 6 months after our wedding. He'd been married to me for half a year, 6 months of morning kisses and weekend dates and whispered promises about growing old together, and he'd already been calculating the value of my corpse. What else? I asked. My voice didn't sound like my own. It was too calm, too measured, the voice of someone discussing quarterly earnings rather than their own planned murder. There's a woman. Chloe Davis, 25, lives in a rental house on the south side. She and Ethan have a son. His name is Noah. He turned 2 last month. Tiffany paused. Emma, the birth certificate, it lists Ethan as the father. And the date of conception. Chloe was already 3 months pregnant when you and Ethan got married. I closed my eyes. 2 years. For 2 years, I had been sleeping beside a man who had another family. Who had planned my death before our first anniversary. Who had looked into my eyes every morning and said, "I love you," while mentally cashing a check. "Send me everything," I said. Photos. Addresses. Everything. Already in your inbox. I hung up and sat in the dark for a long time. The neighborhood was quiet. A dog barked somewhere in the distance. The automatic porch light clicked on, illuminating the front steps where Ethan and I had posed for our wedding photos, his arm around my waist, his smile wide and bright and utterly, completely fake. I thought about crying. The tears were there, somewhere deep down, a reservoir of grief and rage and humiliation that I could feel pressing against the inside of my chest. But I didn't let them out. Because if I started crying now, I wasn't sure I'd ever stop. And I didn't have time for that. I had 3 days until our anniversary trip, 3 days until the accident Ethan had been planning for me, and I needed to be ready. I went inside. I walked past the bedroom where Ethan was sleeping, his breathing slow and regular, his face peaceful in the dim glow of the streetlight filtering through the blinds. I stood in the doorway and watched him. The face I'd once found so handsome, the slight crook in his nose, the way his left eyebrow sat just a little higher than his right, now looked like a mask. A costume. A predator wearing a husband's skin. I was so angry my palms itched. The 4 crescent cuts from earlier were still there, scabbed over now, a physical reminder of what I'd learned. And as I stood there, rage building in my chest like steam in a sealed boiler, my eyes fell on the slipper in my hand. I didn't think. I just acted. The slap of rubber sole against flesh was louder than I expected. Ethan jackknifed it upright with a strangled scream, both hands flying to his mouth, his eyes wild and unfocused. What the? Honey. I dropped the slipper and rushed to the bed, my voice instantly shifting into concern. Oh my God, are you okay? You were thrashing around, I think you were having a nightmare. My mouth. He pulled his hands away and stared at the blood on his fingers. His lip was already beginning to swell, a bead of crimson forming where the skin had split. It feels like, what happened? There was a mosquito. I gestured vaguely at the air. A huge one. It was on your face, right there on your lip, and I tried to swat it away. I guess I didn't realize how hard I was swinging. He looked at me, his eyes still glassy with sleep and confusion. With a shoe. It was the closest thing. I panicked. I let my voice tremble slightly. I'm really, really sorry. Does it hurt terribly? He touched his lip again and winced. It's fine. I just need some ice. I brought him an ice pack from the freezer, wrapped in a dish towel, and sat beside him while he pressed it to his mouth. After a few minutes, his breathing slowed, and the suspicion in his eyes faded into exhaustion. Why are you still dressed? He asked. I just got home. The Henderson campaign is launching next week, and everything's on fire. I sighed, letting my shoulders slump. You know how it is. You work too hard. He reached out and patted my knee. We need this trip. Time away from everything. Just us. His hand on my knee felt like a spider. I had to fight the urge to slap it away. About that, I said carefully. You really still want to go? With your mom still in the hospital? Mom's stable. She said she wants us to go. She knows how important this is. He smiled, his swollen lip giving the expression a grotesque quality. It's our anniversary, babe. 2 years. Remember what we said on our honeymoon? Road trip through the mountains. Just the 2 of us. I remembered. We'd been lying on a beach in Thailand, the sand still warm from the afternoon sun, and Ethan had spun this elaborate fantasy about renting a convertible and driving through the Rockies with the top down and no particular destination. It had sounded romantic at the time. Now I understood that he'd been scouting locations. Friday, I said. We'll leave Friday. His face lit up. Really? That's amazing. It's going to be perfect, I promise. He reached for his phone before I'd even left the room, his fingers already typing a message to someone. I closed the bathroom door and turned on the shower to cover any sound. Through the rush of water, I could hear the muffled cadence of his voice, the tone excited and urgent. Friday. 3 days to turn his trap inside out. I stepped into the shower and let the hot water beat down on my face. My hands were still shaking. But my mind was very, very clear. The next 3 days were an exercise in performance art. I smiled over breakfast. I kissed his cheek when he came home. I asked about his mother's recovery with every appearance of genuine concern. I packed my suitcase for the trip with the careful deliberation of someone planning a real vacation, sundresses, hiking boots, a new bottle of sunscreen, and made sure he saw me doing it. Every gesture was calibrated. Every word was measured. I was playing the role of loving wife so flawlessly that even I started to believe it. But underneath the performance, I was preparing. I bought a new memory card for the dashcam, 64 gigabytes, enough to record the entire drive in high definition. I transferred the old card to my computer and backed up everything. The original files, including weeks of footage showing Ethan's normal driving routes, were saved to 3 separate locations. I met Tiffany at a coffee shop across town, not our usual place, not anywhere Ethan might think to look, and she handed me a manila envelope thick with printed evidence. Bank statements showing transfers from our joint account to Chloe Davis. Cell phone records with hours-long calls to the same number, always when I was at work. Photos extracted from social media, Ethan at a playground pushing a dark-haired toddler on a swing. Ethan at a birthday party with a dinosaur cake. Ethan with his arm around a young woman with a tired smile and a ponytail, her face the face of someone who believed she was the real wife and I was just an inconvenient obstacle. That's her, Tiffany said. Chloe. She's 25, met Ethan in high school, reconnected with him about 3 years ago. She works part-time at a daycare. He told her that you were his boss's daughter, that he was forced to marry you or he'd lose his job, and that as soon as he could figure out a way to leave, he'd come back to her and Noah. And she believed that. She wanted to believe it. You know how it is. When you love someone, you'll swallow almost anything. Tiffany's jaw tightened. Doesn't excuse her, though. She knew he was married. She knew he was living a double life. I spread the photos across the table. Ethan and Chloe at a pumpkin patch. Ethan teaching Noah to walk, his hand steadying the boy's chubby arms. Ethan wearing the same smile he used on me, the one that crinkled the corners of his eyes and made you feel like you were the only person in the world. The diamond necklace, I said, pointing at one of the photos. That's the one he gave her for their anniversary, right? Tiffany nodded. Posted it on Instagram with the caption, "Best hubby ever." Date stamp is October 15th. October 15th. My first wedding anniversary. The day Ethan had given me a $20 scarf in a drugstore gift bag and said he wanted to keep things simple and meaningful. I'd worn that scarf to work the next day and told everyone who complimented it that my husband had picked it out himself. I hadn't just been blind. I'd been willfully, catastrophically blind. All those late nights at the office that I'd accepted without question. All those mysterious phone calls he'd taken on the balcony with the door closed. All the times I'd caught a flicker of something, guilt, irritation, boredom, in his expression before it smoothed back into the adoring mask. I'd seen the signs and I'd chosen to ignore them, because the alternative was admitting that my entire marriage was a lie. Never again. The insurance policies, I said. What happens if he dies instead of me? Tiffany was quiet for a moment. Then she smiled, a thin, dangerous smile that I'd learned to recognize over 15 years of friendship. Legally speaking, if the beneficiary intentionally causes the death of the insured, they lose all rights to the payout. But if the beneficiary dies first, the money defaults to the insured's estate. Which means you. And the dashcam footage. If it shows him directing you into a dangerous situation, telling you to steer toward a known hazard, for example, that's evidence of intent. Combined with the insurance policies and the testimony of the pump truck operator, assuming we can flip him. She spread her hands. You'd have a very strong case for self-defense. Or at least a very compelling narrative for the insurance company's investigation. I gathered the photos and slid them back into the envelope. I need you to do one more thing for me. Name it. If something goes wrong, if the accident doesn't go the way I'm planning, make sure all of this gets to the police. Don't let him get away with it. Tiffany reached across the table and grabbed my hand. Her grip was fierce. Nothing is going to go wrong. You're going to come back from this trip, and he's not, and then we're going to drink an entire bottle of tequila and burn his clothes in the backyard. I almost smiled. Promise. I promise. The night before we left, I saw the peaches on the coffee table. They'd been there for a week, ever since Linda's last trip home before her hospitalization. She'd brought them from her hometown, 2 perfect peaches wrapped individually in old newspaper, their skins a blushing pink gold and covered in a thick, velvety fuzz. She told me they were the sweetest peaches in the state, grown on trees her grandfather had planted during the Depression, and that I should eat them before they went bad. At the time, I'd been touched. Now I understood the gesture for what it was, another performance. Another layer of the mask. I picked one up. The fuzz was so thick it was almost fur-like, soft against my fingers. I thought about Linda's hands wrapping these peaches in newspaper, her gnarled knuckles and the gold wedding band she still wore even though her husband had been dead for 25 years. I thought about her voice through the hospital door, that little bitch, and the easy cruelty in her tone, the casual way she discussed my death like it was a household chore she was tired of waiting for Ethan to complete. And then I thought about what Tiffany had said, years ago, during a conversation I'd mostly forgotten. Something about peach fuzz and sensitive skin. Something about the urushiol oil that gives peaches their protective coating. I carried one of the peaches into the bedroom. Ethan was already asleep, sprawled across the mattress in his boxers. He'd complained about a rash on his thighs for the past 2 days, some mystery irritation that the doctor said was probably allergies, and I'd made sympathetic noises while handing him the prescription cream. I hadn't mentioned that the irritation had started after the first peach incident, which I'd executed while he was in the shower, a quick swipe of fuzz across the inside of his underwear that he'd never noticed. Tonight, I was less subtle. I rubbed the entire surface of the peach against the crotch of his boxers, working the fuzz into the fabric, then replaced the peach on the coffee table and went to sleep in the guest room. By morning, he could barely walk. "It's worse," he said, his face red with discomfort as he shifted from foot to foot in the kitchen. "Whatever this allergy is, it's getting worse. I can barely. Maybe we should postpone the trip." I offered, already knowing what his answer would be. "No." The word came out too fast. He caught himself and softened his tone. "No, I've been looking forward to this for months. It'll be fine. I'll bring the cream. I just hate to see you uncomfortable. It's nothing." He forced a smile. "Really? Let's just go." I watched him waddle to the car, his thighs pressed tightly together, his face a study in suppressed agony, and I allowed myself a single moment of pure, vindictive pleasure. Enjoy the itching, honey. Consider it a preview. Friday morning dawned gray and cool, the kind of autumn day where the sky hangs low and heavy and the air smells like wet leaves and distant wood smoke. Ethan was already in the kitchen when I came downstairs, making coffee in the travel mugs we'd received as a wedding gift, his movements stiff and careful because of the rash. He'd applied another layer of cream before getting dressed, and the sharp menthol smell of it clung to him like cheap cologne. Ready for the trip of a lifetime. He handed me a mug with a flourish that was only slightly undermined by the way he was standing, legs spread awkwardly, weight shifting from foot to foot. "Can't wait," I said, and meant it. Before we left, I excused myself to the bathroom. I had a USB drive tucked inside my bra, Tiffany's handiwork, encrypted and password protected, containing the hospital recording, the insurance documents, the photos, the bank records, everything. I also had the new memory card in the dashcam, freshly formatted and ready. And in the glove compartment, where Ethan never looked because he never drove my car, I tucked a small tactical flashlight with a serrated bezel. Not a weapon, technically. Just a flashlight. For emergencies. I checked my reflection one last time. The woman in the mirror looked calm. Composed. Her hair was neat, her makeup was minimal, her expression was that of a wife heading out for a romantic weekend getaway. She was also, I realized, a stranger. The Emma who had cried at her wedding, who had worn her mother's pearl earrings for luck, who had believed with her whole heart that she was finally safe and loved and home, that Emma was gone. In her place was someone harder. Someone colder. Someone who was about to get into a car with the man who wanted her dead and make sure he regretted ever learning her name. I touched the USB drive through my shirt, feeling its small rectangular shape against my ribs. Let's go, I thought. And I walked out to the car. The first hour of the drive was almost pleasant, which made everything that followed feel even more surreal. Ethan played DJ, queuing up songs from a playlist he'd made for our first road trip together, back when we were still dating and everything between us felt electric and new. He sang along to the choruses, off-key and unself-conscious, and pointed out landmarks through the window, a covered bridge, a field full of sunflowers, a hawk circling over a stand of pine trees. Anyone watching us would have seen a happy couple on an anniversary trip, the kind of people who held hands at red lights and finished each other's sentences. I played my part. I laughed at his jokes. I let him hold my hand over the center console. I talked about the future in the present tense, as though we had one. It was the longest, most exhausting acting performance of my life. "Do you remember how we met?" he asked, somewhere around mile 30. "At that coffee shop. You ran straight into me. Coffee everywhere. All over your suit," I said. I was mortified. I thought it was charming. He grinned. This beautiful woman, completely flustered, coffee dripping off my tie, and all I could think was, I hope she left her real number. I smiled and said nothing. What I was thinking was, you weren't thinking that at all. You were thinking that your plan was working. You'd been watching me for weeks before that accidental meeting, learning my schedule, my coffee order, the exact time I left the office every day. You'd positioned yourself in that doorway knowing I'd run into you. And then you deliberately not called about the dry cleaning bill so that you could arrange a second chance encounter a week later. It had all been choreographed. Every smile, every coincidence, every shared interest. The obscure bands we supposedly both loved. The hiking trails we'd both supposedly wanted to try. The restaurant in Little Italy that he'd discovered right before our third date, which I later learned was Chloe's favorite place. I'd been a mark, not a wife. A target, not a partner. Speaking of chance encounters, I said, keeping my voice light, did you hear about that couple from our honeymoon? The ones from Seattle. They got divorced last month. No kidding. What happened? He was cheating on her. Had a whole other family in Portland. I watched his profile as I said it. His expression didn't flicker. She found out when his other kids showed up at the funeral of a mutual friend. Can you imagine? Finding out your entire marriage was a lie. That's rough. He shook his head, a perfect performance of sympathetic concern. People are unbelievable. Yeah, I said. Unbelievable. The navigation system interrupted with a chime. In 10 miles, take exit 42 toward Pine Ridge Parkway. Ethan straightened up, suddenly alert. That's us. The scenic route. The scenic route. I'd memorized the map the night before, lying awake in the guest room while he slept. A narrow mountain road with hairpin turns, a long stretch of unguarded cliffside, and, conveniently, a bridge construction zone at roughly the halfway point. The sort of road where a car could easily go over the edge. Where accidents happened all the time, especially to drivers who weren't familiar with the terrain. I took the exit. The mountains swallowed us whole. The road began to climb almost immediately, winding up into the pine-covered slopes in a series of switchbacks that made the transmission groan. The trees pressed close on both sides, their branches interlocking overhead to form a tunnel of green that filtered the gray sky into dappled patches of light and shadow. The GPS signal flickered and then died entirely, replaced by a blinking, recalculating message that never resolved. No signal, I said. That's a little unsettling. We've got a paper map in the glove box. Ethan's voice was casual, but his right hand was gripping the door handle now, his knuckles blanched white. Besides, there's only one road through these mountains. We can't get lost. Can't get lost. Can't call for help, either. Can't be tracked, can't be traced, can't leave a digital footprint. It was exactly the kind of place you'd choose if you wanted someone to disappear. We drove deeper. The road narrowed, the pavement growing cracked and uneven, patches of gravel spreading across the asphalt like a rash. To the left, the trees thinned and then vanished entirely, replaced by a sheer drop into a gorge so deep that the river at the bottom was just a silver thread, barely visible through the mist. The guardrail, if you could call it that, was a series of rusted metal posts connected by a single cable, the kind of barrier that would stop a bicycle but wouldn't even slow down a car. Maybe you should move a little more to the left, Ethan said. His voice had changed. The warmth was gone, replaced by something tight and focused. Just to be safe. There's a lot of loose rock on the shoulder. To the left. Toward the guardrail. Toward the drop. There's a sheer cliff on the left, honey. I kept my voice pleasant. I'd rather not get too close to the edge. The road's wider on that side. Look. He gestured at the windshield, his movements jerky with barely suppressed tension. The right side is all rocks and debris. You'll blow a tire. Just move over a little. I glanced at him. His face was pale, a sheen of sweat on his upper lip despite the cool air coming through the vents. His left leg was bouncing with nervous energy, and his right hand had moved from the door handle to the seatbelt release, his fingers resting there casually, as though it was just a comfortable position. He was waiting. Waiting for the right moment. Waiting for the construction zone that I knew was coming up in less than 2 miles. Okay, I said. I'll move left. The relief that flickered across his face was almost comical. The navigation system chimed again, its voice eerily calm. In 1 mile, road narrows. Construction zone ahead. Reduce speed. I saw it before he did. Around the next bend, the trees opened up into a cleared area where the road was being widened. Orange traffic cones lined the shoulder. A portable sign blinked, slow, construction ahead, in amber lights. And parked at the edge of the work zone, its long steel boom extended over a half-finished bridge deck, was a massive yellow pump truck. Concrete dripped from the end of the boom in slow, gray globs. The truck's cab was facing our direction. Through the dusty windshield, I could see a figure in a hard hat. Just sitting there. Not moving. Waiting. I knew, in that moment, with absolute certainty, that the man in that cab had been paid to be there. Maybe he thought it was a prank. Maybe he thought it was insurance fraud. Maybe he'd been told to swing the boom at a specific car and not ask questions. It didn't matter. What mattered was that he was part of the plan, and the plan was about to unfold. My heart rate should have spiked. My hands should have trembled. But I felt strangely calm, as though I'd been preparing for this moment my entire life and was finally ready. Emma. Ethan's voice cracked. Move left. Move left now. Ethan. Now. I could see the pump truck's boom beginning to swing, a slow, deliberate arc that would bring it directly into our path. Not a malfunction. Not an accident. A calculated movement, timed to intersect with our vehicle at exactly the point where the road curved and the guardrail ended and the drop into the gorge was steepest. If I followed Ethan's instructions, if I swerved left to avoid the boom, we'd go through the guardrail and over the edge. 200 feet down into the river below. The car would be crushed on impact. The water would finish the job. And Ethan, who'd been gripping the door handle, who'd probably practiced opening it at the last second and throwing himself clear, would miraculously survive with minor injuries and a tragic story about how his wife lost control of the vehicle. That was his plan. That had always been his plan. But I had a plan too. I wrenched the wheel to the right. The car shot toward the rock wall. Ethan screamed, not words, just a raw, animal sound of shock and terror, as his body slammed against the passenger door. The right side mirror exploded against the stone, showering sparks and glass fragments across his window. The screech of metal on rock was deafening, a sound like the world tearing in half. And then, at the last possible second, I pulled the wheel back, just slightly, just enough to straighten us out while keeping the driver's side tucked tight against the mountain. The passenger side was completely, utterly exposed. Time stretched. The way it does in car crashes and near misses and moments of absolute clarity. I could see individual raindrops on the windshield, when had it started raining, each one perfectly spherical, catching the gray light. I could see the pump truck's boom arcing toward us, the concrete dripping from its tip in slow motion, the rusted steel joint groaning as it swung through its final arc. I could see the construction worker in the cab, his mouth open in what might have been horror or might have been satisfaction, depending on which side of this he thought he was on. And I could see Ethan. His head was turned toward me. His eyes were huge, the pupils blown wide with terror, the whites showing all the way around. His mouth was open, shaping a word, maybe why, maybe no, maybe Emma, but the sound never made it out. In that fraction of a second, I watched his expression cycle through confusion, disbelief, and then a dawning, horrible understanding. He knew. In the last moment of his life, Ethan Harper knew that I'd figured it out. That I'd beaten him. That the trap he'd spent 18 months building had just closed around him instead. I hope it hurt. I hope he felt every millisecond of it. The boom hit the passenger window at full force. The sound was beyond loud. It was a physical presence, a pressure wave that slammed through the car's interior like a fist. The glass didn't break so much as vaporize, turning into a glittering cloud that filled the air and coated everything, the dashboard, my clothes, my skin, in a fine crystalline dust. The steel boom came through the window frame and kept coming, shearing through the seat, through the center console, through everything in its path. Metal screamed against metal. The chassis buckled. The entire car was shoved sideways, grinding along the rock wall in a shower of sparks, and something in the engine block cracked with a sound like a gunshot. My left arm was pinned between my body and the steering wheel, and when the car lurched, the wheel spun violently, snapping my forearm with a wet, grinding crack that I felt in my back teeth. The pain was immediate and blinding, a white-hot spike that shot up through my shoulder and into my skull. I heard myself scream, a raw, involuntary sound that was swallowed by the chaos around me. The airbag deployed. A white bloom of fabric and propellant chemicals punched me in the face, snapping my head back against the headrest. For a long, disorienting moment, everything was white. My lungs filled with the acrid smell of gunpowder and burnt plastic. My ears were ringing with a high-pitched whine that drowned out everything else. And then, silence. Complete, ringing, absolute silence. I was alive. I could feel the pain now, a full symphony of agony playing across my entire body, the sharp, grinding misery in my left arm, the dull throb in my ribs, the stinging cuts on my face where glass fragments had embedded themselves. But I could feel it. Pain meant nerve function. Pain meant a heartbeat. Pain meant I was still here. I didn't look at the passenger seat. I kept my eyes fixed straight ahead, on the cracked windshield and the construction workers who were running toward us with their mouths open in silent shouts, on a single bird circling overhead against the gray sky. I didn't need to look. I knew what I would see. And some images, once seen, can never be unseen. Some memories, once formed, haunt you for the rest of your life whether you deserve the haunting or not. With my right hand, the only one still working, I fumbled blindly across the dashboard until my fingers found the dashcam. I pressed save. The tiny LED indicator blinked twice and turned green. Evidence secured. I let my head fall back against the headrest. The sky through the windshield was gray and featureless, a blank canvas stretching to infinity. Rain had begun to fall in earnest, fat drops that splattered against the broken glass and ran down in rivulets. Somewhere in the distance, a siren was wailing, growing closer. The USB drive was still pressed against my ribs, a small hard rectangle that I could feel with every breath. I closed my eyes. I could hear voices now, muffled through the ringing in my ears, the construction workers, probably, trying to figure out if anyone was alive in the wreckage. I wanted to tell them that I was fine, or at least not dead, but my voice wasn't working. Everything was fading, the world pulling away like a tide going out. My last thought before the darkness swallowed me was surprisingly mundane. I never did get to finish that pigeon soup. I woke up to Tiffany's face hovering 3 inches from mine. "Hey," she said. Her voice was hoarse. Her eyes were red-rimmed, the mascara she'd carefully applied that morning smeared into dark crescents beneath her lower lashes. She looked like she'd aged 5 years in the 2 days I'd been unconscious. "You look like absolute shit." "I feel like absolute shit." My voice came out as a croak, my throat raw from the breathing tube they must have removed at some point. "How bad?" "Broken left arm. 3 cracked ribs. Approximately 7 million bruises. Also you've got stitches." She gestured at her own face, tracing a line from cheekbone to jaw. About 15 of them. The doctors say the scarring should be minimal, but you're going to have a pretty interesting story to tell at parties. I processed this information slowly, my brain still foggy with whatever painkillers were dripping into my fore. And Ethan. Tiffany's expression flickered, something dark and satisfied moving behind her eyes, before she smoothed it away. Ethan didn't make it. The pump truck's boom went straight through the passenger compartment. They had to extract what was left with specialized equipment. The funeral home said closed casket or cremation, no other options. Good, I said. Cremation. As soon as possible. Already working on it. She pulled a manila folder from her bag. But first, you need to see this. She spread photographs across my hospital blanket. Chloe Davis, looking younger than her 25 years, her face pale and tired. A toddler with dark curls and Ethan's unmistakable eyes, clutching a stuffed dinosaur. Screenshots of bank transfers. A birth certificate with Ethan's name on the father line. Chloe Davis, Tiffany said. Ethan's high school girlfriend. They reconnected 3 years ago. She was pregnant before you two even got engaged. She paused, her voice softening. Emma, her son, Noah, he was born 2 months after your wedding. Ethan was there. He's in the delivery room photos. I stared at the ceiling, letting this information sink in. There was pain there, somewhere, a deep, dull ache that had nothing to do with my physical injuries. But it was distant, muffled, like a radio playing in another room. The betrayal was so complete, so total, that my emotional circuits had overloaded and shut down. I'd process it later, probably. In therapy. For years. The insurance policies. I asked. The beneficiary died in the accident, so the payout defaults to your estate. But here's the thing, we've got the dashcam footage. We've got Ethan's voice on the recording, telling you to steer toward a known hazard. We've got the pump truck operator in custody, and he's already starting to talk. She smiled, that thin, dangerous smile again. Ethan's death is going to be ruled an accident caused by his own negligence. You're going to walk away from this clean. I thought about that for a long moment. The gray sky outside the hospital window. The beeping of the heart monitor. The faint, antiseptic smell of the room. And Linda? I asked. Still in the hospital. She doesn't know yet. I thought you might want to tell her yourself. I turned my head on the pillow and looked at Tiffany. I want to be the one who tells her. They released me 4 days later, my left arm in a blue fiberglass cast that itched constantly and my ribs wrapped in compression bandages that made every breath a conscious effort. Tiffany picked me up in her Honda and drove me straight to the funeral home, where the director met us at the door with a folder of paperwork and an expression of professional sympathy that I found almost touching. Mrs. Harper, I want to express my deepest condolences. Don't, I said. Just show me where to sign. I signed. I initialed. I checked boxes. The cremation authorization, the disposition of remains, the release of liability. My signature was steady on every page, steadier than it had been since the accident, actually, because the painkillers had worn off enough that my head was clear but not so much that my arm was screaming. A perfect window of pharmaceutical equilibrium. Would you like to view the remains before the procedure? The director asked. No. Would you like us to provide an urn? We have several options, ranging from just a bag, a plastic bag. He blinked once, a momentary crack in his professional composure. Then he nodded and disappeared into the back, returning 5 minutes later with a black plastic garbage bag, the heavy-duty kind with drawstring handles. Tiffany stayed in the waiting room while I walked to the cremation chamber. I told her I needed to do this part alone, and for once, she hadn't argued. The furnace was a massive industrial machine, all stainless steel and refractory brick, radiating heat even from 10 feet away. The technician, a young man with acne scars and a nervous manner, loaded the remains into a cardboard container and slid it onto the mechanical tray. He glanced at me once, as if hoping I'd change my mind, then pressed the button. The tray retracted into the furnace. The door closed with a heavy clang. Through the observation window, I watched the flames ignite, white-hot and silent. I stood there for the full cremation cycle. 40 minutes. Enough time to think about everything and nothing. Enough time to remember the good moments, and there had been good moments, or at least moments that had felt good at the time, and to accept that every single one of them had been a lie. The man burning in that furnace had never loved me. He'd loved what I could give him. He'd loved the lifestyle, the security, the promise of a future that would belong to him the moment I stopped breathing. And when I'd stopped being a source of money and become an obstacle to even more, the insurance payout, the freedom to be with his real family, he decided I was worth more dead than alive. 40 minutes. The technician opened the door and pulled out the metal tray. The ashes were gray-white and granular, still radiating waves of heat, smelling of nothing in particular. Just carbon and calcium and the ghost of a man who'd never really existed. I poured them into the black garbage bag myself. Behind the funeral home, the drainage ditch was waiting. The same murky water I'd scouted earlier that week. The same cigarette butts and dead leaves and general neglect. I ducked under the bent chain-link fence and stood at the edge, the bag warm and heavy in my good hand. You wanted to eat my inheritance. I thought. You wanted to take everything I had and leave me at the bottom of a gorge. I opened the bag and tipped it upside down. The ashes poured into the water in a gray-white stream, spreading and dissolving, carried away by the sluggish current. Some of it sank immediately. Some of it floated for a moment, catching the light, before the waterlogged particles pulled it under. Within minutes, there was nothing left. Just murky water and floating debris and the faint, fading warmth of what used to be a human being. Let's see how well you digest this. Linda Harper arrived at the funeral home that evening. I timed it deliberately, sending a hospital volunteer to deliver the news just after dinner service, when she'd be awake but groggy from her evening medications. It took her 40 minutes to get from the cardiac ward to the funeral home by taxi, and in those 40 minutes, I'd positioned myself in the lobby, arranged my cast in its sling to maximum visibility, and rehearsed exactly what I was going to say. She came through the doors like a hurricane in orthopedic shoes. One foot in a black Mary Jane, the other in a gray slipper with the hospital's logo printed on the sole. Her hair was a wild gray corona around her head, and her face, the face that had smiled at me over countless family dinners, that had called me daughter, and kissed my cheek and told me I was the best thing that had ever happened to her son, was twisted into a mask of grief and fury. Where is he? Her voice was a shriek, raw and ragged. Where is my son? The funeral director stepped forward, hands raised in a placating gesture that had probably worked on thousands of grieving relatives before today. Mrs. Harper, please, if you'll just have a seat, I can explain. Don't you tell me to sit down. Where is my boy? What did she do to him? I stood up. The movement was slow, deliberate, partly because my ribs still ached and partly because I wanted her to see me. All of me. The cast. The stitches. The bruises that had faded from purple to a sickly yellow-green but were still clearly visible, spreading up my neck and across my collarbone like a map of violence. Linda, I said. My voice was calm, even pleasant. I'm so glad you could make it. She lunged at me. The funeral director caught her by the arms, and a nurse who'd accompanied her from the hospital grabbed her around the waist. She struggled against them, her feet slipping on the polished floor, her screams filling the quiet lobby with a sound like tearing metal. What did you do? What did you do to my son? I walked toward her, close enough that I could smell the hospital antiseptic on her skin and the sour undertone of old sweat. I leaned in, my lips nearly brushing her ear, and spoke so quietly that only she could hear. Your son is in the sewer behind this building. I poured him there myself, about 4 hours ago. Right now, his ashes are floating through the municipal drainage system, mixed with cigarette butts and dead frogs and everything else people flush down their toilets. She stopped breathing. Her whole body went rigid, as though my words had turned her to stone. If you want to report me, I continued, still in that soft, pleasant voice, go ahead. But remember, the police might be interested in the 10 life insurance policies Ethan took out on me, and the dashcam footage of him trying to steer me into a construction accident, and the pump truck operator who's currently in police custody, answering questions about who paid him to swing that boom. If you open this door, Linda, everything comes out, including your part in it. I pulled back and looked into her eyes. They were wide and wet and full of something that might have been terror or might have been hatred or might have been both. But if you want to keep quiet, if you want to let the official story stand, tragic accident, no one's fault, then you could go back to your hospital room and live out whatever time you have left in peace. The choice is yours. Her mouth opened and closed. No sound came out. I turned and walked toward the door. Tiffany was waiting in the car, the engine running, a thin curl of cigarette smoke drifting from her open window. She'd lit up after all, which meant she was more stressed than she was letting on. How'd it go? She asked as I climbed into the passenger seat. Fine. I fastened my seatbelt and watched the funeral home recede in the side mirror. The last thing I saw before we turned the corner was Linda, still standing in the doorway, still frozen, a figure of stone wrapped in a hospital gown. I met Chloe Davis 3 days later. The coffee shop I chose was deliberate, not our usual place, not anywhere Ethan might have brought either of us, but a neutral location downtown with exposed brick walls and industrial lighting and a barista who wouldn't recognize either of our faces. Tiffany was already there when I arrived, sitting in a corner booth with a laptop and an untouched cappuccino, playing the role of a stranger working remotely. Her recording app was already running. Chloe walked in right on time, and my first thought was, she's younger than I expected. The photos hadn't done justice to how young she looked. 25, but she could have passed for 19, with a round, soft face that hadn't quite lost its baby fat and eyes that were already scanning the room with the exhausted vigilance of a single mother. She was wearing a faded denim jacket over a t-shirt that had a small stain on the shoulder, baby spit up, probably, or maybe applesauce, and she was carrying a toddler on her hip who looked exactly like his father. Noah. 2 years old. Dark curls and upturned eyes and a smile that crinkled at the corners. The sight of him hit me harder than I'd expected. Not because I felt maternal, I didn't, but because he was proof. Living, breathing proof that my marriage had been a lie from the beginning. Every time Ethan had kissed me, every time he'd told me he loved me, every time he'd talked about our future and our plans and the children we'd have someday, this child had already existed. This child had been growing in another woman's body while I was trying on wedding dresses. Emma. Chloe's voice was tentative. She'd stopped a few feet from the table, as though sensing a boundary she shouldn't cross. Sit down, Chloe. She sat. She settled Noah into a high chair and handed him a plastic dinosaur from her bag, a practiced motion that she'd clearly done thousands of times. The boy immediately began chewing on the dinosaur's tail, his dark eyes, Ethan's eyes, fixed on me with the unself-conscious curiosity of a toddler. Ethan talked about you, Chloe said quietly. He said. I know what he said. I didn't raise my voice, but something in my tone made her flinch. He said I was his boss's daughter. He said he was forced to marry me or he'd lose his job. He said it was temporary, that he was just waiting for the right moment to leave me and come back to you. Chloe's face went through several expressions in quick succession, surprise that I knew, then confusion, then the beginning of a terrible understanding. The truth, I continued, is that I'm no one's boss's daughter. I own my company. My parents are dead. I have no family except the people I've chosen. Ethan married me for my money. And he was planning to kill me to get the rest of it. No. The word came out as a whisper. No, he wouldn't. He couldn't. I pulled a folder from my bag and spread the documents across the table. The insurance policies. The bank transfers. The dashcam audio transcript, with Ethan's voice clearly audible, telling me to steer toward a hazard that would have sent the car over a cliff. Chloe stared at the papers. Her face had gone gray. I didn't know, she said. I swear to God, Emma, I didn't know. He told me, he said there was going to be an accident, but he made it sound like it would happen naturally. Like you were sick, or, she stopped, realizing how that sounded. I'm not saying this right. There's no right way to say it. I leaned back in my chair. You knew he was planning for me to die. You might not have known the details, but you knew enough. And you were willing to wait. You were willing to build your future on my grave. Tears spilled down her cheeks. Noah, seeing his mother cry, began to fuss in his high chair, his face crumpling into an expression of infant distress. I was stupid, Chloe said. I was young and stupid and I loved him, and I believed everything he told me. I wanted to believe it. I wanted to believe that he was a good man in a bad situation, that he loved me and Noah and just needed time to make things right. She wiped her face with the back of her hand. But that's not an excuse. I know it's not an excuse. No, I agreed. It's not. So what happens now? I slid another paper across the table. This is a list of every dollar Ethan transferred to you from our joint accounts over the past 2 years. The total is just under $40,000. That money was mine. I earned it. And legally, I have every right to sue you for its return. Her face, already pale, went bloodless. I'm not going to do that, I said. Consider it a severance package. But there are conditions. Anything. The word came out in a rush. Anything you want. First, you leave town. Go back to your hometown, or go somewhere else entirely. I don't care where, as long as it's far from here. Second, you never contact me again. No apologies, no explanations, no attempts to make amends. I don't want to hear from you. Third, I looked at Noah, who had stopped fussing and was now staring at me with those wide, familiar eyes. Third, you don't teach your son to hate me. When he's old enough to ask about his father, you tell him whatever story you want. But if he ever shows up at my door looking for revenge, I will not be as forgiving the second time. Chloe nodded frantically. I understand. I do. I'll go, I'll leave tomorrow, There's one more thing. I reached into my bag and pulled out the diamond necklace, the one she'd posted on Instagram, the one Ethan had given her on the anniversary he was supposed to be celebrating with me. I'd found it in her rental house during a visit she didn't know about, while Tiffany was arranging this meeting. This was bought with my money too. I set it on the table between us. The diamonds caught the light, scattering tiny rainbows across the wood surface. Keep it, I said. Sell it. I don't care. But every time you look at it, I want you to remember where it came from. And what it cost. Chloe picked up the necklace with trembling fingers. She didn't put it on. She just held it in her palm, staring at it like it was a snake that might bite her. I stood up. Goodbye, Chloe. Emma. Her voice stopped me at the door. Heath, was it quick? When he died, did he suffer? I thought about the moment before the boom hit. The fraction of a second when Ethan's eyes had met mine, when understanding had dawned on his face, when he'd realized that the trap he'd built had closed around him instead. No, I said. It wasn't quick. I walked out before she could ask anything else. Linda died 6 days later. I'd waited a week before visiting her, wanting the news about Ethan to settle, wanting her to have time to sit with the knowledge that her son was gone and her plan had failed and her grandson, the one she'd been so eager to bring home, was being taken away by a woman she'd never meet. When I finally walked into her hospital room, I found her alone, her VIP suite downgraded to a shared ward on the 8th floor, her insurance coverage having lapsed without Ethan there to manage the paperwork. She looked shrunken. Older. The flesh had fallen away from her face, leaving her cheekbones sharp and prominent, and her hair had gone almost entirely white in the space of a week. When she saw me walk in, she flinched. Hello, Linda. I pulled up a chair beside her bed. How are you feeling? She said nothing. Her fingers clenched the bedsheet. I wanted to show you something. I took out my phone and pulled up the photos Tiffany had given me. Ethan and Chloe at a pumpkin patch. Ethan holding Noah on his shoulders. Noah's birthday party, a dinosaur cake, Ethan's face smeared with blue frosting. I held the phone up so she could see each one. This is Chloe. She was Ethan's girlfriend for 3 years. They have a son together. His name is Noah. He's 2 years old. He has Ethan's eyes, that same little crinkle at the corners. You can really see it in this one. Linda's breathing changed. It became shallower, faster, her chest rising and falling in short, sharp bursts. Noah's never going to know you, I continued, scrolling through the photos. Chloe's leaving town. I'm making sure of that. You'll never meet your grandson. You'll never hold him. You'll die in this hospital bed, and the only thing you'll have left is the knowledge that your son is in a sewer and your grandson is somewhere you'll never find him. You, her voice was a rasp. You're a monster. Maybe. I put my phone away. But I'm a monster you created. You and Ethan. You looked at me and saw a payday, not a person. You planned my death over hospital dinners that I paid for. You smiled at me across the table while calculating how much my corpse was worth. So if I'm a monster, what does that make you? The heart monitor began to beep faster. Linda's face contorted, her free hand, the one not clutching the sheet, pressing against her chest. The funny thing is, I said, standing up, if you just waited, if you'd been patient, you might have gotten everything you wanted. I could have died in a real accident someday. Or gotten sick. Or just grown old and passed away naturally, leaving everything to my grieving husband. But you got greedy. You pushed. You couldn't wait. And now your son is dead and your grandson is gone and you're dying alone in a shared hospital room. I leaned down and kissed her forehead. She flinched like I'd pressed a lit cigarette to her skin. "Goodbye, Linda. I hope it was worth it." She was already gasping when I reached the door. The heart monitor's beeping had become a continuous alarm, and nurses were running down the hallway toward her room. I stepped aside to let them pass and kept walking. She died that night. Acute myocardial infarction, the death certificate said. Heart failure brought on by extreme emotional stress. A natural death, from a medical perspective. No foul play suspected. I arranged her cremation too. Bought the cheapest urn the funeral home offered, a plain ceramic box in a shade of beige that reminded me of old computer monitors. I drove out to the river, the same one that had threaded through the bottom of the gorge where Ethan had tried to kill me, and I poured her ashes into the current. "You don't get to share a sewer with your son," I told the water. "That's too good for you." I kept the urn. It was the perfect size for spare change. A year passed. Then another. Grief is a strange thing. It doesn't move in straight lines. It doesn't follow the stages the textbooks describe. It comes in waves, some days barely a ripple, other days a tsunami that knocks you off your feet and leaves you gasping. But the waves get smaller over time. Less frequent. More manageable. Until one day you realize you've gone a whole week without thinking about it, and that realization doesn't make you feel guilty anymore. I sold the house where Ethan and I had lived. Too many ghosts. The new place was smaller, a 2-bedroom condo with floor-to-ceiling windows that faced west, so every evening the rooms filled with golden light. I bought new furniture. New dishes. New sheets that had never been touched by anyone but me. I rebuilt my life piece by piece, the way you rebuild a house after a fire, salvaging what was still good and burning the rest. The insurance money sat in my accounts, a number on a screen that represented everything Ethan had tried to steal from me. I donated half of it to a women's shelter in the city, the one that took in domestic violence survivors and gave them legal aid and housing and a chance to start over. The donation was anonymous. I didn't want recognition. I wanted to take the money that had been meant to pay for my death and turn it into something that helped other women live. Tiffany and I still had dinner every Tuesday. She proposed, about 6 months after the funeral, that we make it a standing appointment, and we'd kept it religiously ever since. She'd stopped trying to set me up on dates after the third disastrous attempt, a software engineer who spent the entire meal talking about cryptocurrency, and had accepted that my healing was going to move at its own pace. "You're doing better," she said one evening, over a bottle of wine that cost more than our entire dinner. "You laughed 3 times tonight." I counted. "Only 3. It's progress." She swirled her wine, studying me over the rim of the glass. "Do you ever regret it? Any of it?" I thought about the question for a long moment. It wasn't the first time she'd asked, and it probably wouldn't be the last. Some questions don't have final answers. "I regret that it happened," I said finally. "I regret that I trusted the wrong person. I regret that I didn't see what was in front of me. But regret what I did." I shook my head. "No. He tried to kill me. I defended myself. If I hadn't turned that wheel, I'd be the one at the bottom of that gorge, and he'd be the one cashing insurance checks and playing happy family with Chloe and Noah." "It wasn't self-defense, exactly," Tiffany said quietly. "You knew what you were doing. I knew what he was doing. I just did it first." She was quiet for a moment. Then she raised her glass. "To doing it first." We clinked glasses and drank, and the conversation moved on to other things, her latest case at work, my plans to expand the business, the new sushi place that had opened downtown. Normal things. Living things. The kind of things you talk about when you're building a future instead of surviving a past. Chloe did what I asked. She left town within a week of our meeting, moving back to her parents' house in a small town in Ohio. I received exactly one message from her, about 6 months later, a long, rambling email that was half apology and half confession, describing how she'd met Ethan when they were teenagers, how they'd reconnected after college, how she believed every lie he told her because she'd wanted so badly for them to be true. She said she was in therapy now. That she was trying to be a better mother to Noah. That she thought about me every day, and about what she'd almost been complicit in, and that she knew she could never make it right, but she wanted me to know she was sorry. I didn't respond. Some bridges aren't meant to be rebuilt. Some wounds heal better without being reopened. But I didn't delete the email either. It's still in my inbox, buried beneath years of newsletters and promotional offers and work correspondence. Every now and then, when I'm searching for something else, I scroll past it and see her name, and I feel a flicker of something that isn't quite anger and isn't quite forgiveness. Maybe it's just acknowledgement. The recognition that we were both victims of the same man, in different ways, and that we both survived him. Noah would be in elementary school now, learning to read, making friends, growing into the face that looks so much like his father's. I hope Chloe kept her promise and didn't teach him to hate me. I hope he grows up without the weight of his father's sins pressing down on his shoulders. I hope he has a good life, a kind life, a life that was worth everything it cost. But I don't need to know. Some stories aren't mine to follow. One Saturday afternoon, in the autumn of the 3rd year, I found myself driving past the old neighborhood. I hadn't planned to. I'd been running errands, dry cleaning, a new book from the independent store on Maple Street, a birthday gift for Tiffany, and my car had wandered off its usual route, pulled by some invisible current of memory. Before I realized what I was doing, I was stopped at a red light on the corner of 8th and Magnolia, and there it was. The coffee shop. Not the one where Ethan and I had met. I'd never set foot in that place again and never would. This was the one a block over, the one with the good lighting and the barista who remembered my order even when I hadn't been in for weeks. I'd come here often in the months after the accident, when my apartment felt too empty and my thoughts too loud. It had become a kind of sanctuary, a place where I could sit with a latte and a book and pretend, for an hour or two, that I was just a normal person living a normal life. I parked the car and went inside. The bell above the door chimed, and the barista, the same one, still wearing those pink-framed glasses, still smiling, looked up and recognized me. Emma. The usual. Please. I waited at the counter, watching the steam rise from the espresso machine, breathing in the smell of roasting beans and warm milk. The cafe was mostly empty, just a few students with laptops and an older couple sharing a scone by the window. Rain was starting to fall outside, light and misty, blurring the edges of the street. When my latte was ready, I took it to a table near the back and sat down. I didn't have a book with me. I didn't have my phone out. I just sat there, cradling the warm cup in my hands, watching the rain trace patterns down the window glass. My left arm ached faintly, the way it always did when the weather turned cold. The doctors had said it might never fully heal. There'd been nerve damage, and the bone had required 2 surgeries and a metal plate to set properly. I'd learned to live with the discomfort, the occasional stiffness, the way I couldn't quite rotate my wrist all the way anymore. It was a reminder, I supposed. A physical echo of everything that had happened. A scar I could see and touch, unlike the other ones. The door chimed. A man walked in, late 30s, gray suit, slightly damp from the rain. He was in a hurry, the way people are when they're running late for something important, and he was looking at his phone instead of where he was going. He nearly collided with a chair, dodged at the last second, and caught my eye with an apologetic grimace. "Sorry," he mouthed. I smiled and shook my head. "No problem." He ordered at the counter, collected his coffee, and headed back toward the door. As he passed my table, he paused. "Hey, isn't it Emma?" I looked up, startled. For a moment, I didn't recognize him, just a pleasant-looking man in a gray suit, with kind eyes and a slightly crooked smile. Then something clicked. The marketing conference last spring. The panel on digital strategy. We'd been seated at the same table during the networking lunch. "Mark," I said. "Right. From the conference." "That's me." He gestured at the empty chair across from me. "Are you waiting for someone, or?" "I'm not." The words came out before I'd fully decided to say them. "You can sit. If you want." He sat. He had a nice smile, I noticed. The kind that reached his eyes. The kind that didn't look practiced. "I've been meaning to reach out to you since that conference," he said. "Your presentation on brand storytelling was incredible. I took about 8 pages of notes." 8 pages. "You should probably get a hobby." He laughed. It was a genuine laugh, unforced and warm. Outside, the rain was falling harder now, drumming against the windows and blurring the streetlights into golden smears. Inside, the cafe was warm and quiet, smelling of coffee and cinnamon and something that might have been fresh bread. We talked for an hour. About work, mostly, and then about other things. Books we'd read, places we'd traveled, the strange and winding paths that had brought us both to this city. He was divorced, he mentioned casually. 2 years. No kids. He'd moved here from Chicago for a fresh start. "Fresh starts," I said. "I know something about those." I figured. He gestured at my left arm, where the scar was visible below my pushed-up sleeve. "That looks like it has a story." "It does." I looked down at the scar, the thin silver line that traced from my wrist to my elbow, the faint puckering where the bone had come through the skin. "Maybe I'll tell you sometime." "I'd like that." He pulled out his phone. "Can I give you my number?" "No pressure. Just, if you ever want to get coffee again. Or tell that story." I looked at him. The kind eyes. The crooked smile. The way he was holding his phone, slightly hesitant, like he was already prepared for me to say no. "Sure," I said. "Give me your number." He did. I saved it in my phone under Mark, conference, nice smile. We talked for a few more minutes, and then he glanced at his watch and winced. "I'm supposed to be at a client meeting in 15 minutes. I should go," I said. "It was nice talking to you." "You too, Emma." "Really?" He stood up, grabbed his coffee, and headed for the door. At the last moment, he turned back. "I'll call you." "About the coffee. Or the story. Or both." "I'll answer." He smiled one last time and disappeared into the rain. I sat there for a while longer, finishing my latte, watching the storm roll past. The rain was already beginning to lighten. A crack had appeared in the clouds, and a thin shaft of golden light was slanting down through the window, illuminating the dust motes floating in the air. My phone buzzed. "Tiffany. Hot pot tonight. The place on 6th. Don't be late." I typed back, "Wouldn't miss it." I stood up, pulled on my coat, and walked toward the door. As I reached for the handle, another customer was coming in, a young woman in a hurry, clutching a laptop bag and an umbrella that had turned inside out in the wind.
没有呢。
She nearly ran into me, then stopped short, apologizing. I'm so sorry. I wasn't looking.
，OK 了不？
Careful with your coffee, I said, stepping aside. It's hot. She blinked, confused, and then laughed. Thanks.
没有呢。
I'll remember that. I pushed open the door and walked out into the rain-washed afternoon. The sidewalk was slick and gleaming, reflecting the gold of the breaking clouds. The trees along the street had shed most of their leaves, but a few golden ones still clung to the branches, trembling in the breeze.
，OK 了不？
My car was parked a block away. I walked slowly, taking my time, letting the clean post-rain air fill my lungs. A song was stuck in my head, something old, something my mother used to play on the piano when I was little. I couldn't remember the name of it, but I remembered the melody.
OK 了不？
Simple,
没有呢。
gentle, a little sad, but mostly hopeful. I got in the car. The passenger seat was empty except for a half-read novel and a folded umbrella. I put my phone in the cup holder, buckled my seatbelt, and started the engine. The radio came on mid-song, and I recognized it immediately, Louis Armstrong, singing about trees of green and red roses too, about skies of blue and clouds of white, about a wonderful world.
没有呢。
I pulled out of the parking space and merged into traffic. The road ahead was wet and shining, leading away from the coffee shop, away from the old neighborhood, away from everything I'd left behind. But it was also leading towards something. Dinner with my best friend. A phone number in my contacts list.
没有呢。
A future that was still unwritten but finally, genuinely, mine. The sun broke through the clouds, and the world turned gold.
OK 了不？
I turned up the radio and kept driving,